Welcome, Dark Night Tales. Tonight's story pulls us back to 1897, into a world where truth was feared more than lies. This is the Lydia Johnson Enigma, the story of a black girl whose intelligence shattered every scientific limit of her time. Doctors tested her, scholars observed her, and newspapers whispered her name, yet no one could explain how her mind worked. Now let's step into the mystery they tried to bury. In 1897, America stood at a dangerous crossroads where so-called science was often used as a weapon rather than a search for truth. This was the era of Jim Crow laws, forced segregation, and racial violence openly justified by academics and doctors who claimed black people were biologically inferior. Universities taught racial hierarchies as fact. Medical journals promoted theories measuring skull sizes and brain weight to prove white supremacy. Intelligence, in the eyes of mainstream science, was not something a black child was supposed to possess, especially not in excess. Against this backdrop, fear ruled the scientific community. When observations challenged racial doctrine, they weren't celebrated, they were buried. Any discovery that threatened the social order was labeled dangerous. A black girl demonstrating intellectual abilities beyond trained scholars wasn't just inconvenient, she was a direct threat to the foundation of American racial ideology. Accepting her brilliance would have meant admitting that the entire scientific framework of racial superiority was false. So instead of asking how Lydia Johnson was so intelligent, the system asked a different question: how do we explain her away? In a society where science served power, not truth, Lydia's mind became something to fear. Because if she existed, everything they claimed to know was a lie. From the moment Lydia Johnson was old enough to speak, those around her noticed something deeply unsettling, especially by the standard of 1897. She did not speak in fragments or childish guesses. She spoke in complete, deliberate thoughts. Words came to her fully formed, as if she were recalling knowledge rather than learning it. By the age when most children struggled with basic letters, Lydia was reportedly correcting adults, questioning assumptions, and memorizing entire passages after hearing them once. What disturbed observers most was not just her intelligence, but her speed. Lydia absorbed information instantly. She could listen to complex explanations, mathematics, anatomy, even mechanical theories, and repeat them back with unsettling accuracy. Witnesses later claimed she asked questions no child had the social permission to ask, challenging teachers, ministers, and physicians alike. In a time when black children were denied even basic education, Lydia displayed an understanding that surpassed formally trained white scholars. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed she could read without being taught. Others said she solved problems before they were finished being explained. Neighbors whispered that her mind was unnatural, not as praise, but as warning. Instead of being nurtured, Lydia's abilities triggered suspicion. In a society already terrified of black excellence, her genius was not seen as a miracle. It was seen as a problem that needed to be controlled, studied, or silenced. When word of Lydia Johnson's abilities reached local academics and physicians, curiosity quickly replaced disbelief. But it was not the kind of curiosity meant to protect a child. In 1897, scientific examination often meant intrusion, control, and exploitation, especially when the subject was black. Lydia was not invited to be studied, she was summoned. Doctors, educators, and self-proclaimed scholars gathered, not to understand her mind, but to test the limits of their own theories. They subjected her to written problems, far beyond standard education, then escalated to verbal logic puzzles, memory trials, and pattern recognition tests never intended for children. Lydia answered calmly. She solved equations without visible effort. She repeated long strings of numbers forward and backward after hearing them once. When questioned on topics she had never formally studied, she made intuitive leaps that stunned the examiners into silence. As their astonishment grew, so did their discomfort. Instruments were brought in, measuring her skull, timing her responses, monitoring her pulse, as if her brilliance must be physically contained somewhere they could point to. But every measurement contradicted their expectations. Lydia did not fit the data, she broke the charts. And instead of adjusting their understanding, the men in the room adjusted the narrative. What began as examination quietly shifted into interrogation. Notes were rewritten. Results were labeled anomalies. Some examiners argued she was coached. Others suggested deception. None were willing to accept the simplest explanation that Lydia Johnson was genuinely extraordinary, because admitting that truth would have meant confronting a fear far greater than ignorance that science itself had been wrong. After the examinations, detailed notes were compiled, test results, observations, and conclusions that quietly terrified those who recorded them. Several physicians attempted to submit their findings to regional medical and academic journals, believing Lydia Johnson's case could become a landmark discovery. But in 1897, publication did not depend on truth alone. It depended on whether the truth was acceptable. Editors hesitated. Review boards delayed. Requests for clarification and additional verification piled up, not because the data was weak, but because its implications were explosive. A black girl outperforming established scientific expectations threatened decades of published racial theory. Printing Lydia's results would have forced journals to contradict their own past claims that supported segregation, discrimination, and the intellectual justification of oppression. Quietly, submissions were rejected. Some papers vanished without response. Others were returned with vague explanations, methodology concerns, insufficient precedent, results too irregular. Behind closed doors, conversations took a darker tone. A few editors reportedly warned contributors that publishing such findings could damage their careers. One physician later wrote that Lydia's case was scientifically sound but socially impossible. So the truth never reached the public record. Instead of rewriting textbooks, science erased a child. Lydia Johnson's brilliance was confined to private notes, locked drawers, and fading memories, proving that in 1897, the greatest threat to scientific progress was not ignorance, but fear of what the truth would expose. As Lydia Johnson's case circulated quietly among elite academic circles, a new response emerged, denial dressed as authority. Scholars who never met her, never tested her, and never reviewed the raw data began declaring her existence scientifically impossible. To them, Lydia was not a child with a remarkable mind. She was an error that needed correcting. Prominent academics argued that her abilities violated natural law, Some claimed her results must have been exaggerated by sympathetic observers. Others suggested mass hysteria or coincidence. A few went further, proposing that Lydia was merely mimicking information without true understanding, an argument often used to dismiss black intelligence at the time. None of these scholars offered proof. Their certainty came not from evidence, but from ideology. What made Lydia most dangerous was not her intelligence, but the fact that she did not fit neatly into any existing category. She was too young, too black, too brilliant. Accepting her would have forced scholars to dismantle racial hierarchies they had built entire careers upon. So instead, they rewrote the rules. If the data didn't match the theory, the data must be wrong. By labeling Lydia impossible, academia protected itself. Her mind became a forbidden anomaly, discussed in whispers, dismissed in public, and buried beneath authoritative statements meant to sound final. In the end, it wasn't Lydia who failed science. It was science that refused to survive her. Once Lydia Johnson could no longer be dismissed, the tone of her examinations changed. What began as observation turned into control. In 1897, there were no ethical boards to protect a black child, especially one whose existence challenged powerful beliefs. Lydia was no longer seen as a person, but as a subject. Physicians pushed her beyond mental testing. They deprived her of rest to measure mental fatigue. They repeated examinations for hours, hoping exhaustion would expose fraud. Some introduced sensory stress, bright lights, sudden sounds, rapid questioning, to see if her composure would crack. It never did. Lydia remained focused, calm, and unsettlingly precise in her answers. There were whispers of more invasive procedures. Pulse, breathing, reflexes, every bodily response was scrutinized as if her intelligence had to be physically extracted. One account described examiners arguing over whether her mind operated mechanically rather than humanly, a statement that stripped her of childhood and dignity in a single breath. These experiments were not about discovery. They were about breaking proof into something manageable. When Lydia continued to outperform expectations even under strain, the researchers faced an unbearable conclusion. The problem was not her mind, it was their limits. And instead of stopping, they went further, crossing ethical lines without hesitation, because in their world, protecting a theory mattered more than protecting a child. Despite efforts to contain Lydia Johnson's case, fragments of the story escaped into the public sphere. Teachers spoke in half sentences. Neighbors whispered. Small-town newspapers hinted at a remarkable colored child, without ever printing her full name. The vagueness was intentional, enough to spark curiosity, not enough to demand accountability. Rumors took on a life of their own. Some claimed Lydia could recite entire books after hearing them once. Others said she corrected doctors mid-examination. A few darker stories painted her brilliance as something unnatural, even dangerous, turning admiration into fear. In a society already conditioned to distrust black excellence, these whispers made suppression easier to justify. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Families were warned to stay silent. Educators were advised not to speak publicly. Certain records were reclassified. Others simply disappeared. Lydia's name stopped appearing in correspondence, replaced by coded references and initials. What couldn't be erased was minimized. What couldn't be minimized was buried. This was suppression without spectacle, no arrests, no headlines, just silence. And silence, in 1897, was one of the most effective tools of control. By allowing rumors to exist without confirmation, the system ensured Lydia Johnson would remain a mystery rather than a fact, something to doubt, not something to confront. Then, without warning, Lydia Johnson vanished, not physically in a way anyone could easily trace, but historically. One year her name appeared in examination notes, letters, and private reports. The next it was gone. Census references stopped. Academic correspondence fell silent. Even local mentions faded, as if she had never existed at all. Researchers who later searched for Lydia found gaps where records should have been. Dates were missing. Pages were torn out. In some archives, files ended mid-sentence. No death certificate surfaced. No relocation documents appeared. It was as though Lydia had been erased deliberately, not lost by accident. There were quiet theories. Some believed she was sent away, placed in an institution where her mind could be controlled and hidden. Others suspected her family was forced to move, names altered to avoid attention. A darker possibility lingered in the background, that Lydia's brilliance made her too inconvenient to be allowed a future anyone could witness. What remains most unsettling is not that Lydia disappeared, but how easily it happened. In 1897, a black child could be removed from history without protest, without investigation, without record. And once the paper trail ended, so did responsibility, leaving behind only a haunting question: what happened to a mind the world refused to understand? Though Lydia Johnson disappeared from records, her story left a shadow that still lingers, a legacy both quiet and profound. Science in 1897 attempted to erase her, to declare her impossible, but her brilliance left traces in the whispers, the private notes, and the memories of those who witnessed her mind. For decades afterward, a few scholars referenced her abilities in secret, often in footnotes or personal journals. Acknowledging the anomaly they could never explain publicly, her existence challenges the notion that intelligence can be measured, categorized, or contained. Lydia proved that brilliance does not conform to social hierarchies, racial assumptions, or outdated scientific paradigms. Modern historians and researchers, uncovering fragments of her life, describe her as a precursor, a warning of how easily society silences extraordinary talent when it threatens the status quo. Lydia's legacy is also symbolic. She represents all the brilliant black children of history whose gifts were ignored, suppressed, or destroyed simply because they did not fit the narrative of their time. Science may have tried to erase her, but every rediscovery of her story is a victory over that erasure. Today, Lydia Johnson endures as a haunting reminder that true genius can never be fully contained, and the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of resurfacing.